This is the last Sunday in Pentecost. Next Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent, which means there are only 5 Sundays between now and Christmas. Christ the King Sunday. We know, especially because of the Bible study we've done recently, about several kings in the Scriptures. Give me the names of several kings that you're familiar with that come from Scripture. David, Saul, Solomon, good. Those are the big ones. David, Saul, Solomon, not in that order, but that's good. The rest of them are, unfortunately, not as noteworthy, because most of them were not great kings. What? King Herod, another one from Scripture. Most of them, as a matter of fact, were not terrific leaders, which is usually what we look for when we think about a king, isn't it? Or is it? When you think about a king, what first comes to mind? What?
A ruler.
A ruler, okay. Order, a leader,
A crown.
a crown, a queen. I think, especially in my lifetime, of course, there have the person who I always think of as having the most significant role in our history as a leader in the most positive way, of course, would be Lady Diana. And her leadership role, and what that looked like, and how she cared for the people, and how she was present with people, and how she would hold the hands of people who had AIDS, and how she would go and look and be aware of the damage that landmines would do. And so I hold her in greatest esteem. Now, usually when we think about kings and queens, unless sometimes there's been a lot of news recently about Saudi Arabia, but usually we're trying to check for baby bumps or where the latest event is. Usually not significant, impactful things. What did God say to the people of Israel when they told him they wanted a king? They said they didn't need one, did they? They didn't listen, did they? But they kept expecting a king, didn't they? They kept expecting that they were going to have a king, and that king was going to be strong and mighty and a ruler. But there's a real difference between a ruler and a leader, isn't there? Yes. And when you think of the characteristics of a leader, what do you think of? Someone who leads by example. Okay. What else?
Charisma.
Okay.
Charisma.
Charisma. Okay.
Wisdom, compassion, honesty.
Wisdom, compassion, honesty. Great. Right. A leader has to have followers. Exactly. So the difference between a leader and a ruler. A leader, a ruler, and a king. In David's final discourse, which is the first reading we had this morning, David is talking about finding a place for God. And in that, he says the place for God to be would be the Ark of the Covenant. And David created the Ark. And what was placed inside the Ark? The Ten Commandments, exactly. Okay? The Ten Commandments were inside the ark. And so, in some ways, David was saying, okay, we have found a place for God to be, a resting place. But I think more importantly than the literal translation of creating the Ark of the Covenant or creating a temple for God, what David was really talking about was, how do I find a place for God inside of me? It's a much more significant question. How do I find a place for God inside of me? What does that look like? What is that vessel? What kind of space can I create so that I know that God is inside of me? And that light, which is God, has the opportunity to shine out. Then we come to the gospel lesson today. And the gospel lesson is from John. And Jesus comes before whom? Pilate. And he comes in, and Pilate says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews? Are you the king?" Why do you think Pilate asked that question? To see if he could get him on blasphemy. Okay? Because there's an expectation. Do you think that Pilate was really that in tune to think that the king of the Jews would also be the Messiah? Or do you think he was thinking of more about a ruler? It was probably more concerned about a ruler, don't you think maybe? Why would that be? Competition, exactly. Exactly, competition. Yeah. What, are you my competitor? Are you my competitor? Do I have to worry about you coming in and taking over? Because why? The people, he had a following, didn't he? And this could have been a serious situation that Pilate was in. In it, it says, "I'm the Alpha and the Omega." These are Greek letters, aren't they? Yeah. And one is at the beginning of the alphabet, and one is at the end of the alphabet. Jesus says, "I am the beginning, and I am the end." It's me, all the way through. And interestingly enough, this gospel lesson in today's reading stops short of what I think is probably one of the most important questions that Pilate asks. And does anybody know what that question is? Pilate says, "What is truth?" What is truth? That's what Pilate wants to know. Jesus says, "Those who hear my voice hear the truth. They know the truth." And then Pilate comes and says, "What is truth?" It's a question for us today, isn't it? It's a question for us. How do we get to truth? What is truth? And I spent a lot of time in the last 3 or 4 days contemplating this question. How do I present this question today? What is truth? How does it relate to leadership? What does it mean to have someone be the king or lord of our lives? How do we create that space to let God in and then rule over us? How do we know what truth is? Jesus answers that question quite clearly in Scripture. Ultimately, what he says is, "I am the truth." He says, "I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life." And ultimately, if our rulers today spent a little bit more time looking at the example of Christ's life, he was an ultimate leader. He was the ultimate leader because he put himself in the scenario with He was the first one to make the sacrifice, wasn't he? He was the one that made the sacrifice. He said, I am going to show you what it is like to lead. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice my life. So ultimately you understand that you never have to worry about yours. That God loves you so much and brought you into this world that you don't have to worry about death, because there is nothing that will ever separate you from God. Nothing. In doing my research, I came across a gentleman. His name is Simon Sinek, and he recently wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. And he talks about how in the military, the officers eat after their troops eat, and why that is, and what that means, and what kind of an example it sets, and what it says about the care and the compassion that leaders have for the people who follow them. And it struck me that that in the Lutheran tradition, the clergy people usually take communion last. In the Episcopal tradition, the clergy people take it first. I think that maybe our Lutheran brothers and sisters, from a sense of leadership, maybe doing it, maybe there are good theological reasons to do it that way, that we may not have considered before. Because when we bring people to table and we make sure that everyone is fed, and we ourselves are last fed, it's kind of like when you have company come over, and if a lot of extra people show up, in our house they have that thing, family hold back, right? And we're going to make sure everybody else eats first, and then we're going to make sure that we eat. That's leadership. It's hospitality. It says that the people that are around us are important. It also means that if we ask them to do something for us, the likelihood is that they would, because that they know we care about them. Leadership. Different than being a king. Different than being a ruler. So the question as we head into this Advent season is, how do we take Christ the King, Christ the ultimate example of a good leader, and incorporate him into our lives in a new way? Advent is a time of creating space. And we do that in our homes, but then things get crazy in our lives, don't they? And instead of being intentional about making our own spiritual space, things get all crammed in there, like Christmas cards and buying presents and seeing people and going to parties and decorating and all those things, which is the exact opposite of what we're called to do. Ultimately, what we're called to do is to make space, is to clean out those things in our lives that are cluttering them up, so that we ultimately get the gift of Christ being the King and the ruler of our lives.